It is one of the most influential and famous texts of magic that nobody has ever heard of, but it's everywhere. I mean, pieces of it are found in all kinds of other books. It appears in all the major encyclopedias in the 13th century.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander F., and today we're so excited to talk about the hermetic origins of medieval lapidaries with return guest and scholar Vajra Regan. So how did medieval lapidaries, or books detailing stones and their magical properties, smuggle Arabic esoteric knowledge into Europe? What was the Arabic Hermetica corpus found in Europe 100 years before the well-known Picatrix or the Ghayat al-Hakim? How did these sources influence Latin translations of the same material? Well, scholar and author Vajra Regan is the best person to ask. He first appeared on Glitch Bottle to share about a previously unknown version of the Liber Almandel Salamanis from the 1200s, and he returns in this episode to share about his new research and an article that he co-authored entitled The Hermetic Origins of the Liber Sigilorum of Tekel, which was published in the Journal of Medieval Latin earlier this year. Vajra studies classics at UC Berkeley, majoring in classical philology, and studied Latin, Ancient Greek, and Coptic, getting his master's at the Medieval Institute at Western Michigan University, and then continued with PhD work at the Center for Medieval Studies at the University of Toronto. Vajra's new co-authored article demonstrates that the oldest version of the lapidary, the Liber Sigilorum, the Book of Sigils, was adapted directly from the Latin translation of an Arabic book of astral magic known as the Liber Planetarium, or Liber Saturni of Hermes. This is such a fascinating episode about the importance and the smuggling properties of esoteric information contained in medieval lapidaries, and a huge thanks to each and every supporter of Glitch Bottle on Patreon for your questions and your support of the podcast. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome back Vajra Regan. Vajra Regan, thank you so much for taking the time and returning on the Glitch Bottle podcast today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. The pleasure is mine. It's so good to be here.
Can you give us, Vajra, kind of the big picture on lapidaries and what kinds of magical or potentially magical procedures and uses were being described in these texts?
Absolutely. Yes, that's a good place to start because the word lapidary has basically fallen out of the English language. And even many medievalists only have a very vague idea of what it signifies. But basically, in the Middle Ages, lapidaries were catalogs of precious gems and stones. And in the late Middle Ages, particularly in the scholastic period, so 13th, 14th century, there was a kind of mania for cataloging everything in the world. And it was the great period of encyclopedias. So lapidaries, in some sense, fit into this larger enterprise. So basically, there are these catalogs of stones, and they describe the characteristics of stones and so forth. But that's actually a somewhat misleading definition. They were a lot more than just catalogs of stones. And really, most of the lapidaries in the late Middle Ages are, in fact, books of amulets. They're books of amuletic magic. And this is apt to surprise a lot of people because the conventional narrative, of course, is that magic is a marginal activity. You know, it's something that's conducted underground and in the shadows. And lapidaries were some of the most popular books in the late Middle Ages. They spread everywhere. So, you know, how can this be? How these books of amulets were so popular in the late Middle Ages? And as it turns out, they played a pivotal role in the transformation of Western magic, because it was really through them that a lot of the new Arabic magic that had been translated in the 12th century and early 13th century, they were one of the main vehicles by which this new learning was transmitted and diffused to the rest of Europe.
Can you tell us a little bit about working with Lowry Akin and what made you both decide to co-author this incredibly important investigation into this specific medieval lapidary, the Liber Sigilorum?
Yeah, it's a rather interesting story. Lowry and I had met at academic conference many, many years ago. And I am currently editing a large text, a huge lapidary in 5 books. And so I had to deal with this problem of the Book of Sigils because it incorporates large parts of that. So I had been working on that, and the more I researched it, the more I realized that there was a lot more to the Liber Sigilorum than I had ever thought. And I kind of almost got derailed into this because it was just so interesting. And I collected all this information on it. And Lowry had contacted me in the process of this, asking some questions about a previous article I had written. I had forwarded him the article and so forth. I didn't think much of it. And then a mutual friend of ours contacted me and said, you and Lowry seem to be working on very similar projects. You should maybe get together and compare notes and stuff. I was like, sure, absolutely. So we started contacting by email and sharing information. And as we started to compare notes, we realized that we both had 2 pieces of the same puzzle. And so instead of writing 2 separate articles, we were like, well, no, we just have an article right here. We have the complete pieces all together. We just need to join them. And so that was really the start of it.
Now that you've laid this context down about medieval lapidaries and how you and Lowry were working together, can you tell us a little bit about this particular work, the Liber Sigilorum, and what was it about this specific lapidary? What do you find so fascinating? Can you tell us a little bit about the context and Tekel and, why it's called the Liber Sigilorum? That would be awesome.
Let me rewind just a little bit here to give some additional context. The importance of the lapidary literature was recognized as far back as 1987. David Pingree, the great historian and polymath of mathematics and science and magic, published an article titled "The Diffusion of Arabic Magic Texts in Western Europe." And the main point of that article, the main subject, really had nothing to do with lapidaries, but he needed to explain why this Arabic magic, this learned magic of astral magic and talismans, became so dominant and popular in Western medieval culture. And at the beginning of that article, he comes up with this historic model in which he argues that it was really the lapidaries that were the crucial link, that they were the bridge between the primitive magic of the early Middle Ages and the learned magic of the later period. And this bridge is kind of leading up to the threshold, the grand threshold of the astrological talisman, which he considered to be really the height of learned magic, because this was a magic that actually required the operator to have a very sophisticated understanding of astronomy and the mathematics underlying it in order to carry out any of the operations. And he thought this was actually very important to science. So he saw the lapidaries as kind of how this all connected and why Europeans were able to accept this new learning that had been only recently transmitted to the Latin West. But the funny thing is, he never followed up on that thesis. And so it kind of langured, overshadowed by, all his other great work and stuff. It has been noticed by a number of really prominent scholars who have built on it. But for the most part, it was still underdeveloped. And in that article, he talks about the Liber Sigilorum as being one of the three major lapidaries that comprise this bridge, as it were, leading up to learned magic. Well, as it turns out, Pingree was even more right than he knew, because it didn't just lead up to the threshold of astral magic, it crossed over it. And like I said, it was one of the main vehicles by which all this Hermetic magic got transmitted everywhere else. So just to give a little foreshadowing here, and we'll circle back to this more, the Liber Sigilorum in its original form really is just a Latin adaptation of one of these Arabic Hermetic texts that was translated in the mid-12th century, and that was basically thought to be lost. This text was extremely popular, particularly in Paris in the early 13th century, and circulated widely. But by the end of the 13th century, the condemnation was so fierce and so complete that they literally eradicated every single copy, to the point that scholars thought that it was lost forever. Then somebody discovered a single manuscript that preserved this text. It was in a 15th century manuscript, a unique manuscript preserved in Florence. And as we looked at this manuscript, which has never been published, never really been studied by anybody, we started comparing it. And it turns out the Liber Sigilorum actually transmits this manuscript. And so, yes, it's true that they eradicated most of this manuscript, almost completely. But there's also this other truth, which is that it continued to survive in the form of the Liber Sigilorum, going completely unnoticed by most people and being assimilated into the encyclopedias, philosophical works, and so forth. So that was really the attraction, to realize that this Hermetic magic hadn't disappeared, it hadn't been eradicated, and in fact had embedded itself very deeply into medieval culture. All right, so with that out of the way, what is the Liber Sigilorum? I suspect very few people are familiar with this text, and yet it is one of the most influential and famous texts of magic that nobody has ever heard of, but it's everywhere. I mean, pieces of it are found in all kinds of other books. It appears in all the major encyclopedias in the 13th century. Camillus Leonardi, who wrote The Mirror of Stones in the 15th century, he incorporated no less than 3 different versions of his text in his printed book. I mean, that's how popular it was. Peter of Abano devoted serious attention to it. Albert the Great, of course, the famous Dominican philosopher, theologian, and yet it has gone almost completely unstudied. So anyway, so what is the text? It emerges for the first time in the late 12th century, and it purports to describe various engraved gems which are to be fashioned into amulets, specifically magic rings. And it starts off with this prologue, supposedly by Tekel or attributed to Tekel. And it claims that Tekel was one of the quote unquote philosophers of the Jews and among the ancient Israelites during the time of the Exodus. And when it came to that crucial moment when they were engraving, they needed to engrave all the gems for the liturgical vestments of the high priest, of Aaron, and all the ritual paraphernalia. He was somehow involved in this process and wrote a book about all the gems and the images of power engraved or impressed on these gems and their magic properties and so forth. So that's kind of the origin story that we're given for this text. And then we have this series of chapters that describe different gems and the images of power engraved on them, and detailed instructions about how to fashion the rings, what type of metals to use, the herbs and animal matter that is supposed to be enclosed under the gems set in the rings, and these long lists of powers.
Given that context, we have a listener question for you from Glitch Bottle patron Jabril. And Jabril is asking and saying, "Hi, Vajra. I'm always looking for the planetary connections with lapidaries. Can you share about the gems and or rings in the Liber Sigilorum, and if the rings have planetary associations? Thank you."
Yes, that's a good question and very interesting. The short answer to that is they all have planetary associations. Here's the difficult part. Like I said, the Liber Sigilorum was a living text, constantly being altered, transformed, and so forth. So as it gobbled up all the other texts, not all of these had astrological associations. The text gets rearranged, so the connection to astrology becomes very obscured. And scholars right up even to this day have argued about whether the Liber Sigilorum really is astrological or not. Some people say it is, other people. Oddly enough, David Pingree was convinced that there was nothing astrological about it, which is kind of ironic since he actually edited the Ghayat al-Hakim. But if we peel back all the accretions and get down to the nucleus, the oldest version of the text, yes, all of the gems, the metals, the rings all have planetary associations. Each of them are under the dominion of a specific planetary deity. So, for example, the rings of Saturn, typically the stones are turquoise, jasper, hematite, onyx. The metals are what you would think, actually, lead predominantly, although we also find tin alloy or an alloy of silver and lead, and occasionally iron. For Jupiter, the stones tend to be crystal or really any white translucent stone, as well as some golden colored stones. And the metals tend to be silver, gold, red copper mixed with white brass. And then the rings of Mars, all of them are iron. And oddly enough, the stone is always magnetite. But there's only a few rings of Mars in there. So
I know one of the things that I wondered too, Vajra, given that context, was, oh my goodness, what do some of these incantations, some of these excerpts actually sound like, or what do they look like in the text? So to that point, can you, Vajra, perhaps read for the listeners an excerpt from one of these manuscripts, either Tekel A1 caught my eye, or really any excerpt that you feel might give listeners a flavor of how the manuscript is laid out?
Sure. The objectives and the kinds of powers attributed to these rings, they cover the entire spectrum of magical operations that you can imagine, from sowing love and discord, finding treasure, summoning spirits, hydromancy, various healing cures, and so forth. Now, there's a lot of actually pretty nasty stuff in there as well. One of my favorites is the ring that gives its possessor the power to command the spirits that dwell in darkness, and it will entice them to reveal a treasure in fleeting song. But yeah, the Ring of Saturn is particularly interesting. So I'll go ahead and just read a little bit from the properties that are attributed to this ring. So it says that the first ring preserves the work of the field and all agriculture, buildings, livestock, and the foundations of buildings, and wells of running water. And it is good for discoveries of treasure. If an epileptic should wear it, he will be cured. Similarly, if he washes it in a spring on which the sun does not shine and drinks from the water, he will be cured. If the same preparation is given with water of bdellium, fennel, and rue, it expels the sickness of the asthmatic and the person suffering from melancholy and the evil poison that is produced by black bile. If an infant carries it around his neck, it drives away from him every fear and harassment of evil spirits. If a sluggish person carries it, he recovers his health. If a he-goat, bull, or any four-footed animal in one's possession carries it, it casts off and drives away from that animal all lethargy, evil eyes, and enchantments. And it goes on with, that ring has a particularly long list of properties. A really interesting feature of these rings is a lot of them can be used as magic signet rings. In other words, once you have the engraved stone and set it in its proper ring, you can impress the image in wax. And there's special instructions for preparing the right type of wax. And if you impress the image in the wax, it creates a wax amulet with its own powers that you can give to somebody else. So these rings become machines for fabricating other amulets. It's interesting. I noticed that you had Irving Finkel on your podcast, who is an absolute treasure. And I loved hearing him speak. He has so many great videos on YouTube. And anyone who hasn't discovered him yet, I strongly encourage you to take a look at some of his videos. He is an Assyriologist and expert in cuneiform writing, as you know, and has done a lot of research on these ancient amulets. You know, these ancient Sumerian and Babylonian amulets, they're written in cuneiform on these clay tablets, and many of them were used to impress other clay tablets. And, you know, they would give the amulets to people and stuff. And it was a form also of writing and signing your signature on documents. There really is a kind of continuity stretching all the way back from these books of amulets in the Middle Ages to those ancient amulets that Irving Finkel talks about. Some of the similarities are so striking. When he talks about the exorcism of the demons and binding them or summoning them for protection and so forth, and the rituals of the dead, and the huge role that amulets played in all of this. He talked about the severed head that was used for divination and so forth. And of course, we find that in the Ghayat al-Hakim as well.
To that very point, Vajra, you say in the article, you and Lowry, that, quote, although the text might seem to trespass overtly on the domains of illicit magic, it enjoyed a remarkable success and was arguably the most widely copied lapidary of the late Middle Ages, unquote. And we were talking about this before the podcast, but can you share with the listeners about why was a text like this, you know, such a success and the most popular or second most popular lapidary?
Yes, it's complex. There's a lot of reasons why this becomes so popular. One of the reasons is the way the text has been revised by the late 12th century Christian Latin editor. He's removed all the ritual elements from the text. And he comes up with this very kind of brilliant literary conceit. So in the Book of Planets, which all of this stuff is based on, it's very explicit that the operator is supposed to engrave the images himself. And there is a very elaborate ritual and prayers to the planets and astrological instructions. He doesn't include any of that. And not only that, he never tells the reader to actually engrave the images himself. As I mentioned, there is this prologue which states that the images were actually engraved by the ancient Israelites under the supervision or order of God. So the text presents itself as a kind of field manual for identifying those images that have already been engraved on stones and that have been left over from the ancient Israelites. So every single entry begins with the same formula. If you should find a stone with this image engraved on it, okay, so this is one of the legitimate images engraved by the ancient Israelites. It's not a pagan image. Although, in fact, all the images are completely pagan. They're very reminiscent of the kind of phantasmagoric images we find on the so-called Gnostic gems or magic gems or amulets from Egypt. It manages to avoid the prohibition against graven images. It doesn't explicitly tell the reader to engrave the images. It comes up with this backstory, this origin story that, no, really, these were images engraved by the ancient Israelites during the time of Moses and the Exodus and so forth. Interestingly, it does tell the reader to fashion the rings himself, and it gives very detailed instructions on how to fabricate the rings, which metals to use, even the precise weight, and so forth. But nevertheless, this was kind of considered within the bounds of respectability. The other thing you have to consider is that amulets have always been popular. Even though Augustine of Hippo and Isidore of Seville and all these great church fathers had condemned amulets, they never lost their popularity in both popular and elite culture, and especially because of the various healing properties attached to these amulets. I mean, that's the funny thing. I mean, when somebody's lying on their deathbed and is in pain, all these strictures against, don't use amulets and stuff like that, it starts to become negotiable, If somebody comes along with an amulet that they say that this will cure you and cure your pain, then it's like, okay, sure. So that connection to medicine, which was really strong, was one of the reasons why this stuff was accepted.
Is that connection to medicine, Vajra, as well, to your very point, one of the reasons why the Liber Sigilorum exerted, as you say in the article, such a broad influence, extending well beyond strict lapidary literature? Because as you mentioned, we have, Peter de Abano, we have Albertus Magnus, of course, the teacher of St. Thomas Aquinas. Would that be one of the reasons?
Absolutely. And it was precisely the medieval physicians who really adopted this text. And it actually becomes embedded in medieval medical writings of the time and the curriculum and so forth. And part of that had to do also with Constantine the African, the great physician of the 11th century. He was the first one to bring all these Arabic medical texts and introduce them to the West, which was a complete revolution. And some of those texts do talk about the medical use of amulets. I mean, Galen, in his authentic works, talks about various experiments he conducted with amulets. And then there's also the pseudo-Galenic literature of medical amulets. And as it happens, in the late 11th century, shortly after Constantine's death, some of his disciples kind of spliced a lot of these works together. So these magical lapidaries together with these medical lapidaries. And this text became very famous. And this was the text that Marbode of Rennes, the Bishop of Paris, converts into this massive, really elegant poem, which is just based on this medical text. But the poem becomes so popular that it really just blows the doors open to this idea of, oh, wait, maybe this is a kind of technology that we can really use. And because Constantine the African was at the forefront of this new Arabic learning, I mean, remember, Constantine introduces this in the 11th century before the Arabic Latin translating program really takes off. So he's way ahead of the curve. And people would read this poem by Marbode of Rennes, which talks about all these amuletic stones and incorporates all this new Arabic learning in it. And they thought, oh, well, this is the direction we have to go. You know, it kind of legitimized it. I mean, the irony is that Marbode just wrote his poem as it really an exercise in elegant versification, but people took it seriously because in the mid-12th century, of course, you suddenly have all this Arabic learning washing over the Latin West. And so they looked to this poem, this lapidary poem, as being on the cutting edge of the new learning. So all these factors kind of came together to make lapidaries or these books of amulets acceptable in mainstream intellectual culture.
Vajra, that is a perfect transition into talking about the massive, massive influence and importance of Arabic esoteric literature and learning as it flows into Europe. And to that very point, you mentioned in the article that Dr. Caitlin Messler first noted that images in Tekel, in Liber Sigilorum, have analogs in the Arabic Picatrix that many listeners are familiar with, the Ghayat al-Hakim. But as you and Lowry say, Tekel predates the Picatrix by arriving in Europe by about 100 years. So to that point, can you share about this Arabic Hermetica corpus that was flowing and moving around Europe 100 years and more before the Picatrix? What would you like listeners to know?
Yes, well, I really have to give credit to Caitlin Messler for noticing those similarities. It was really quite clever of her to spot that. And yes, there's an obvious, there's a major question here. I mean, there's no doubt that the Liber Sigilorum predates the translation into Latin of the Ghayat al-Hakim. So how is this possible? Well, in the mid-12th century, we find that a corpus of related or loosely related Arabic Hermetic texts gets translated, probably mostly in Spain. And these texts with titles such as, these titles are fantastic. The Stations of the Cult of Venus, the Book of Venus, so many interesting things, the Rings of Venus, and the Orations to the Planets, and of course, the Book of the Planets. These all get translated from Arabic in the mid-12th century. And it seems very likely that these texts were actually the sources of the Ghayat al-Hakim. It's very interesting. These texts, unfortunately, all of the Arabic texts on which these were based are lost. So we only have the Latin translations. And even many of the Latin translations have either been lost or again survive in one or two very badly preserved copies from the 15th and 16th century. But when they were initially translated, this was all very new to the people in the Latin West. And so from the midpoint of the 12th century to the beginning of the 13th century, this stuff was just spreading everywhere and people were really excited about it. And it hadn't come under condemnation yet. That was to change radically by the end of the 13th century. And as I kind of touched upon a little bit at the beginning, I mean, this condemnation was so sweeping that ultimately they just eradicated all of these texts, which is why people thought it was just lost. I mean, we have testimonies of them. We have people like William of Auvergne, the Bishop of Paris in the early 13th century, giving very detailed descriptions of these texts, as well as other authors, such as the author of the Speculum Astronomiae, who the author was thought to be Albert the Great. Actually, now it turns out he probably wasn't the author. But that text talks a lot about them and gives very insightful quotations from them, as well as several other texts. So it was this interesting period in the late 12th century, early 13th century, where this stuff was all just freely circulating and not really condemned. And you have people taking it and assimilating it into, these native traditions, such as the Lapidaries. And that's how they kind of first initially smuggled them in there. They got rid of all the original translations, but they didn't notice that a lot of this stuff had already been absorbed into the Lapidaries. And people also realized, oh, wait, the Lapidaries are the perfect cover for this stuff. Well, let's just squeeze more in there. They become a way of disguising and transforming this material and preserving it.
To your very point, you were describing the Liber Sigilorum of Tegel and that lovely literary conceit, where it's like, well, if you happen to find a stone that is engraved, that's like for listeners who are familiar with famous grimoires like the Lemegeton's Goetia, it would be like having a text that says, well, if you happen to find a demonic sigil inscribed in gold and a sword and a circle in the wilderness, this is perhaps how you could, what it would mean and how you could work with that. Now, I'm not telling you to make these things, but
no, of course, don't make them yourself. But but if you happen to be on pilgrimage somewhere, walking along, you kick over a rock and there's a stone with an image there. Well, you can pull out your handy copy of the Liber Sigilorum, check through. Oh, wait, it's this image here. Okay, I can use that. And people in the Middle Ages, there were people who recognized and didn't have a problem with engraving these images themselves. And Peter of Urbano was definitely one of them.
It seems also, Vajra, speaking of manuscripts surviving, you were touching earlier on the third important manuscript in this article. There's, of course, the Liber Sigilorum of Tegel. There's the Picatrix, the Ghayat al-Hakim. And then there's this preserved now in a unique manuscript in Florence, the Liber Planetarium. Can you go a little bit deeper into sharing with the listeners about the Arabic origins of the Liber Planetarium manuscript and why it's so important? And especially, as you said, it includes very specific instructions for making it. No need to stumble across a gem in the wilderness. You can engrave it with the images itself. So can you share a little bit about the context there?
Yes. Well, there's a lot of mystery surrounding the origins of that text. The proximate origin seems to be a group of Neoplatonizing Muslims in Andalusian Spain who were interested in this stuff and wrote most of these texts, which ultimately were used by the author of the Ghayat al-Hakim. They may have started calling themselves the Sabaeans. And there's a lot of debate and kind of controversy and questions about who exactly the Sabaeans were and whether any of these texts actually do preserve the original writings of the Sabaeans. So the Sabaeans were a group of polytheists or pagans. I don't like to use that word because pagan is really a derogatory term, but we're kind of stuck with it. They were based in Haran, and they managed to preserve or hang on to their traditional beliefs up until, I think it was the 10th or 11th century, before they finally become eradicated. And many scholars, including David Pingree, throughout the 20th century, were convinced that these texts, as well as the fragments that are preserved in the Ghayat al-Hakim, are actually remnants of the astral liturgy of the Sabaeans, because it seems that they practiced a kind of astral cult revolving around the worship of the stars. And it's even said that Hermes Trismegistus was among their prophets. This theory has come under increased scrutiny in the last few decades, because the truth is, everything we know about them comes from Muslim polemicists who were extremely hostile to them. I mean, we know almost nothing certain about them. I mean, when I first read through these manuscripts, and there's so much detail about the priestly vestments and each of the planetary deities, there's specific vestments, different colors for each of the planets, and specific incenses that need to be prepared, and ritual paraphernalia. And there's a complete astral liturgy with very specific instructions about the times when all these things are to be carried out. And it seems so detailed that you kind of think, well, yeah, this has to be at the very least an avatar of their religious writings. I confess, the more I go through this, the more skeptical I am about that. But the question is still open. So again, what does seem certain is that the proximate origin of these texts is, again, this secret society might be a little bit overdramatic, but this group of Muslim intellectuals in Spain who were interested in all this stuff and in the writings of Hermes. And they were the ones who passed this on.
To that very point, Vajra, in the Liber Planetarium, you and Lowry share that the manuscript states that when engraving a Saturn-themed ring, for example, it says, quote, "Within sight of the engraver, there must be men singing the sweetest and saddest songs like the songs of the dead, and they must weep," unquote. I mean, a perfectly Saturnine theme for this operation. And I remember thinking, gosh, I wonder what those songs sounded like. But can you share more about these incantations and ritual elements? Yeah, fascinating.
Well, among the same set of texts, we actually have a copy of the orations to the planets. Unfortunately, not with the music, but perhaps giving us an idea of what some of these songs said. But yes, I would love to hear them. This is one of the most fascinating elements about these texts, because this is not a lone practitioner. He has all these attendants, and then there's the artisan who's making the ring and everything. And here's the really fascinating part, is that depending on the planet, the officiant and his attendants and so forth, they had to dress in the costume of the planetary deity, which means that if the planetary deity happened to be Venus, they had to dress up as Venus. And it talks about, the artisan, this blacksmith who has to construct this ring dressed up as Venus. And I just have this image of this burly blacksmith dressed up in his costume of Venus, making this ring while these people sing these songs and so forth. And this gets picked up on by William of Auvergne. He was the Bishop of Paris in the early 13th century, and he writes a lot about these texts. And he really hates them, but he obsesses about them. He talks about all these rituals of Venus and all these books of Venus. And he describes these rituals where, men dress up as Venus and women dress up as Mars. But he also tells us that when he was young, so this would have probably been in the first decade of the 13th century, when he was a young scholar just starting out in the University of Paris, that he had become seduced by these books. And then he quickly says, oh, well, I realized that the vanities of those and repented of my errors and stuff. But I can't help but think that he got mixed up into something, because his subsequent hatred of magic and Saracens and he associates all of this stuff with the typical quote unquote Orientalism, the stereotype of the effeminate East and so forth. So he's kind of really perpetuates all that.
Right. To modify Shakespeare a little bit, we might look at him and say, methinks thou condemneth too much, right? I mean, there's something there. There's some
there is
element.
something there. It's like the bully in high school who's always the quickest to accuse somebody else of being in the closet is invariably the one who has something to hide.
Vajra, to your point, you mention in your article with Lowry that, quote, at present, the lapidary literature still remains largely unexplored, but it can hardly be doubted that it has much to tell us about the continuities and transformations of magic in the Middle Ages, unquote. And so to that point, Vajra, what are some of the future directions of research that you would like to see in this area of medieval lapidaries, especially following your article with Lowry, which added this incredibly rich context? Where do you want to see this go in the coming months, years, decades?
I hope this is going to be a really fertile field. There's so much of this literature, and almost none of it has been examined. None of it has been looked at. And it's so rich. It contains so many mysteries and so many things that could open up our understanding of magic and its transmission and the various transformations that it underwent. My previous article, in which I discussed this very early version of the almandal or almadel, that was embedded in a lapidary. So that's one lapidary that contained a really early version of the almandal. And now we have another one that contains all these Hermetic texts. There's these other lapidaries out there that I've looked at that contain elements of the Liber, the Book of the Mysteries, the Shemhamphoros, all these other texts, but nobody looks at them. Because it's just, the conception is that, books of stones, Everybody wants to focus on, the really big questions or popular trends and stuff, without realizing that there's this whole terra incognita where you have all these texts and just all this stuff to be found just by looking. All you have to do is look. And there's so much stuff that could fill in all these gaps and questions and give context to all this other stuff. And it's just there for the taking if you're willing to look for it.
And this is obviously a broad generalization, but I think what you're driving at is so many people want, this is the forbidden manuscript from 938 CE that shows you exactly how the first Goetic sigils were drawn in Europe, and these are the connections. But what you're saying is, because of their extra blanket of security, of maybe preserving things, hiding things. No, no, no. It is the lapidaries that are the doorway. The lapidaries are the vehicles of the transmission of this Arabic, Jewish, Latin-based knowledge, Greek knowledge flowing into Europe in the Middle Ages. Would that be fair? That's where you want to look.
Yes. It certainly wasn't the only route of transmission, but it was an extremely important one and one that's been highly overlooked. And again, I think people are just kind of scared to venture into a new area. They want some confirmation that, yeah, there is actually something there. So hopefully we're making some progress in this area and showing people that, yeah, there's this whole rich area of study. It's like prior to the discovery of the first exoplanet, nobody was studying exoplanets in, astronomy, because that was kind of considered fringe. And then once they discovered the first exoplanet in, I guess, like mid or early 90s, suddenly that everything was about exoplanets, and they started finding them everywhere. And it's kind of a similar thing here. So it's just a matter of looking.
Vajra, something I know we talked about, I believe, last time, and something I've asked scholars and other guests too, is how do you look for and locate these manuscripts? For example, the Vatican archives, they're consistently digitizing and uploading new manuscripts. Is it, gosh, if I could just get into the sub-catacombs of the Vatican, or gosh, there's this library in Istanbul that nothing's been touched for 50 years, or maybe an archive in Romania, or is it just scattered? Where are some of those texts? And is there a place where you say, hey, for the future of lapidaries, look here? Or is it just everywhere?
Yes, the major libraries of Europe are obviously the starting point for a lot of this. And there have been great, Thorndike's bibliographic work has really led the way on a lot of this, just his cataloging of incipits and manuscripts, many of which have still not been investigated. And likewise with David Pingree, all his bibliographic studies and so forth. And also you have to have the training in languages and paleography. You have to be able to read the manuscripts. And that is becoming, unfortunately, a dying skill. And then also just connecting them with the other sources. And one of the huge problems with the Liber Sigilorum, like I was saying, one of the reasons why progress on this text has been so slow, even though if you look at the article, there's an entire page of bibliography. People have written on this text almost nonstop since the 19th century, but actual progress has been surprisingly slow and very few systematic studies. And again, that's because it was all kind of tangled with all these other texts and everything. So it was a matter of peeling back the different layers and just going through it and isolating that, that core original text. And also I've had the advantage of being able to stand on the lofty shoulders of people like Pingree and Burnett and all these other great scholars who have done all this other work and produced all these editions that have allowed me to recognize, oh, wait, no, that's the Almandal in there. That's the Almandal. I wouldn't have been able to do that if it hadn't been for Julian Veronese's brilliant critical edition of that text. So it's a combination of all those things. But really, so much of it comes down to knowing the languages and being able to read the handwriting, which takes a lot of work. And many graduate students are actually dissuaded from going into that area. It all comes down to being able to read the primary sources. So much of the stuff, even the primary sources that have been explored, when you actually go back to the manuscripts and check them, which hardly anybody does, you find out that there all kinds of mistakes were made in transcribing these manuscripts or how they were interpreted and so forth. So there's endless work.
there's this awesome element of collaboration. And, we've touched earlier on, obviously, with yourself, with Lowry, talking about Dr. Caitlin Messler, but also in the article, you share and state that, quote, the authors would like to extend their thanks to Elisa Brilli and Matthew Melvin Kushki for sharing their knowledge of medieval Italian and Arabic, and to Joseph H. Peterson, who generously took the time to read an early draft of the translations and provide many helpful suggestions, unquote. So, clearly, just with yourself and the names there, we have some excellent luminaries. Can you share about, with this article and also just research in general, why collaboration among scholars is so important?
Yes, it's absolutely essential. Collaboration is so good. And I feel particularly fortunate to have people like Matt Melvin Kushki and obviously Lowry and Joseph Peterson and Elisa and so many other people. Charles Burnett has always been just incredibly open. I owe him so much. Greta Dukova Brun, who has been a light and inspiration. Yeah, collaboration is very important in this stuff because it's very easy to bullshit yourself in this industry and to think that you got the answer. And especially when you're dealing with texts like this that overlap with Arabic and medieval Italian and art history and all these different areas. So to have these people who I can actually ask questions about and discuss this stuff, and sometimes just in the course of a discussion, it'll be like, oh, wait, yeah, it's really quite essential. He was the co-author with Neil Gaiman on Good Omens.
Terry Pratchett? No, wait.
Yes, exactly. Okay. If you've read any of his books, there's this ongoing joke about the invisible college. So it's this invisible college of wizards and so forth. That joke is funny on a lot of different levels. The term invisible college, it's actually a legitimate term in the sociology of science. And it refers to the informal network of scholars who trade information back and forth. And it's been recognized that this network is vitally important for progress and new discoveries and advancements and so forth. And I often think about that, the invisible college. It's such a great term. But yes, that network of people to rely on and to save you from making errors. So many times, I know working with Lowry, who I have the highest respect for his skepticism and just his sober approach to this material. And he would say like, well, I don't think this part really holds up. I don't think the evidence is there. And I would think about it and I'm like, yeah, you're right. The evidentiary basis needs to be firmer. So yeah, let's strike that. So just to have somebody like that to bounce ideas off of and so forth, absolutely vitally important. And Joe is always great, a brilliant Latinist. And it was so great that he took a look at an early draft of the translations. I always respect his opinion.
It's so wonderful to see those amazing collaborations between scholars all over the world. It's encouraging. It's heartwarming. It's so excellent, Vajra. And of course, yourself and Lowry adding to that constantly, the body of knowledge. And I think this leads to, can you give us some hints, Vajra? Someone with a scholarly mind such as yours, what else are you working on in the upcoming projects, or what ideas are you thinking about? And then also, how can listeners check out your work and support you?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, my main project right now is trying to finish this critical edition and commentary on a massive lapidary in 5 books. Again, this is another lapidary that has smuggled in, and this time very deliberately smuggled in and disguised many of these Hermetic texts. the books of Venus and so forth. And there's all these amulets and sigils, and then also hermetic alchemical works. I'm trying to finish that up. It has been a huge project and has taken way more time than I had initially expected, but it's led to many, many good things. And yes, Lowry and I are planning to continue our collaboration, and we have some more ideas that we're working on.
Definitely, listeners, check out the podcast and video descriptions below for a link so that you can get your own copy of this excellent article from Vajra and from Lowry. Again, the article is entitled The Hermetic Origins of the Liber Sigilorum of Tekel, which was published in the Journal of Medieval Latin earlier this year. Vajra Regan, scholar, author, context delineator, someone who is absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time and sharing this amazing context with the listeners today. Always such a treasure and a pleasure.
Absolutely. No, it's entirely my pleasure.
Listeners, I hope you enjoyed that chat with Vajra Regan as much as I did. I love the context that Vajra provides in this article that he co-authored. Talking with Vajra and reading the article, it felt like someone was taking a comb and running it through the tangles, the complex Byzantine tangles of medieval lapidaries and medieval history and the transmission of texts, and it was just so rejuvenating. So check out the podcast and video descriptions below to pick up your own copy of Vajra's article that he co-authored. And as always, a huge thank you thrice to each and every Glitch Bottle patron and supporter on patreon.com/glitchbottle. It is literally because of you that the podcast continues to grow in new and interesting ways. And if you'd like to hop on the Glitch Bottle caravan and become a supporter and put up with a lot of nerdiness and some really cool perks, check out the links below as well on patreon.com/glitchbottle, and we'll see you there. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, smuggle esoteric knowledge in lapidaries, and keep the light.